Welcome to the 444th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. Stay tuned for my interview with John L. Ford, author of the science fiction novel Dominion. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is John L. Ford, author of the new science fiction novel Dominion. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much for having me.
Sure. If someone hasn't heard yet about your new novel, Dominion, how would you describe the novel?
I would love to describe the novel as a return to the old format. And what I mean by that is that science fiction in terms of literary form, really when it first came on as an art form years and years ago, decades ago, with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and so forth, these are the forefathers of science fiction. They wrote basically in one kind of pillar of science fiction, which is what we call hard science fiction. And since then, we have evolved into what we later call cyberpunk and these other forms of science fiction, which are really more into the humanities, which is how does technology and science affect us on personal or more spiritual level, if you will. And you can write thematic arcs that are focused in either one of these two kind of genres. So subgenres. My novel, I literally consciously attempted to go back to the original form and look at the school of what's happening now in terms of science and technology and try to visualize or extrapolate a vision of the future based on what that might mean in terms of where it's going. And because of that, you really can't write, in my opinion, you really cannot write effectively in either genre without crossing over and borrowing from the other one. So what my story starts in a very hardcore science fiction form. It will try to artfully guide the reader into more of a spiritual implication or more how it affects the characters within the storyline towards the end of the story. So a little dry at the beginning, but very sweet sort of towards the end. So hopefully that gives you a quick rundown of the...
Sure. What was the original impetus or idea, if you remember, that led you to start writing Dominion?
I get a little personal there. Just to give you a little bit of background, going all the way back, I started at the age of emails in the 1990s. I started finding that I couldn't stop writing when I was writing simple emails to friends, professional. And people, I would get positive feedback. And I just, this is amazing because when I was growing up, I was literally told by English teachers that I should not try writing. I should just try to avoid it altogether. I was inarticulate and so forth. But I think I'm just naturally inclined to be a communicator. I really am not shy of speech, and I have a pretty, I think, natural flow of consciousness. And I think anybody that's an author, that's whether they're in success or not success, but enjoys authoring, will tell you that they're like that. They get into a flow of consciousness and they just don't want to stop. And that would reflect in the early technology of email and so forth. And I started getting feedback like, you should really try putting these thoughts into some kind of writing project or something of that nature. And I started getting accolades over the years. And I just decided, I guess in my mid 30s to early 40s, that maybe I should try and do something because I didn't want to wake up when I was 70 years old and wish I had. I've only got a couple of marbles rolling around in the head or whatever. I'm not trying to say anything bad about old. I'm sure there's plenty of really gifted writers into their hundreds or whatever. But what actually happened is, it's an interesting kind of thing. I was riding in traffic, listening to NPR, and they had in their technology and science section discussion, they were talking to a neuroscientist at the time. And this is back in like 2006 or 2007, actually. So it's pretty dated in the early inception of this story. And they were talking about these biological processes in the human brain. They're called microtubules, which are literally nanoscale protein filaments that are focused in densities along the neurotapestry of the brain. And science, according to this interview, science at the time were trying to determine what process they serve in nature. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but as you look around in nature, a lot of times it's prevalent that nature doesn't really waste or invent things that it doesn't necessarily use. And for things to survive the evolutionary track, they tend to have a purpose. So what do these purpose serve? So these microtubules. And for some reason, it just hit me that I could create a story where these microtubules probably have something to do with the emergence of like thought and consciousness and the evolution of the mind as a gestalt, if you will, as a synergistic emergence of the brain. Because you have the brain, but the brain isn't you. A brain creates you. You know what I mean? So maybe they were somehow instrumental in all that process. And it just hit me like this ton of bricks. And like, what a cool story it would be to have an engineer. And like a lot of great scientists, like Leonardo da Vinci postulated the helicopter looking at dragonflies. I don't know, like these stories and these kinds of things. A lot of times scientists and engineers rely on nature's model to try and create or mimic different technologies. And so wouldn't it be something if the engineers tried to recreate microtubules using carbon nanotubes and superfiber optics and so forth, and these solid state physical materials to try and, mimic the processes that they're observing in the human brain to create experimental apparatuses to try and prove certain aspects. And so I started writing and it just flowed right out. And I just created a whole story around that where the consequences of AI or self-awareness, in a sense, materialize out of the accidents of tinkering in that sort of realm of mimicking nature's process using solid state. So it's basically a marriage of solid state physical components with actual biological physiology. And then out pops the plausibility of artificial intelligence in a unique kind of way.
So you heard this radio story, and that got you thinking, and you ended up writing the novel. What was the journey to getting this novel, Dominion, published?
It really was not a very complicated one. I was lucky, to put it in simple terms. I had tried a couple of publishing houses and I didn't get a rejection letter. I went right to the top. I tried Prometheus, and they actually sent me a letter back saying they wanted several chapters and so forth because they loved the concept and their whereabouts. So I sent that material to them and I just never heard back. So I assume no information is as good as a rejection in this industry, as it were. And then I tried Penguin, and they were kind enough to send me a rejection notice. And then my sister, who resides in the Mid-Atlantic, was actually, and she's into literature and reading and writing and so forth herself. And she went to an expose at a local Barnes and Nobles, and my would-be publisher was actually there that day doing a presentation. And she just happened an opportunity to introduce herself to this gentleman. And she goes, if you're looking for science fiction lead-ins right now, and she just introduced me and she connected me to him. And I sent my material to him and they loved it immediately and said that and to my luck, he is an accomplished author himself. And right. In science fiction, and he really loves the old format. So when he started seeing the way that my story was put together, how Colton Reinhold, the main character, begins in an auditorium in college, and obviously the story is going to have some stuff to make it relevant and so forth, and hopefully bring the reader in and so forth. But he has this flash of insight, which is really my flash of insight, but it's going to be told through the lens of the character in the story. You know what I mean? So he's listening to the teacher discuss these microtubules and neurons. And, I did a lot of research in actual neurobiology and everything for those opening passages in the story. And anyway, my would-be publisher got wind of the way that was put together in those first several chapters, and he couldn't wait to get to contact me.
That's great.
So, yeah.
When did you first discover science fiction literature?
When I was young. I don't know what young is. I wasn't reading when I was really young. I actually got really into it more when I was a teenager. Like, I hear a lot of these stories about people that kind of reclused inside their blanket with a flashlight and stayed up, past their bedtime and read magazines and stuff when they were in their adolescence. And that really wasn't me. I was a dreamer by trait. I was fascinated with environmental and natural sciences, astronomy, earthquakes, meteorology. As it were, I ended up with a meteorology degree, which is why I'm a software engineer, of course. So as I started to grow up, I started getting into reading, and I was first introduced to Arthur C. Clarke, and I read his Rama book, and then I got into Isaac Asimov. I read his Foundation series after that, which is, these kind of writers were what I would consider to be crossover writers. They weren't as much like the original format, but they were both in a sense. So maybe in some sense, my book is written like my exposure, which is in that kind of arena of those kinds of authors. And I'm a big fan of Michael Crichton, big time. I loved like the Andromeda Strain and Airframe and those kinds of books that he wrote also later on in his career. So
sure.
Yeah.
So are you working on another novel now?
Yes, I am. As a matter of fact, I have an idea that's going to sound kind of way out there, but my idea is that I don't know how familiar you are with the background of physics, but there are two main pillars of physics that describe the natural universe. One is quantum mechanics, and the other is general theory of relativity. And at a fundamental level, mathematicians cannot reconcile these two disciplines, when at the same time, each discipline in its own right is reproducible. It shows up in experimentation as being factual. So they, for all intents and purposes, based on empirical and objective observation, exist and are real. General theory of relativity is proven all the time by observing large celestial motions in the cosmos and making predictions therein. And quantum mechanics works because we have cell phones. I have an idea that tries to maybe reconcile how and why those, basically, when you look at a singularity and a black hole, for example, where the gravity becomes so extreme that light cannot escape and the acceleration of gravity exceeds the speed of light, we call that the event horizon. When you try to plug in general theory of relativity into quantum mechanics, basically you get all kinds of crazy divide by infinity expressions in the mathematics, and you can't get those two disciplines to solve. And the physical representation of that failure to resolve those differences is at the event horizon, because basically what's happening is that general theory of relativity is a synergistic result of quantum mechanics. In other words, below the event horizon, you fall below the threshold of the emergence of general theory of relativity. So basically, general theory of relativity is a mathematical expression that begins to describe origin of and the actual sort of what I call projection of reality, which is what comes out of quantum mechanics. So it's almost like quantum mechanics is the projector, if you will, and the image that the movie that we're seeing of reality is general theory of relativity. So it's like you can't go into the projector to see the movie. And that's what it means when you try to go through the event horizon of a black hole. And we're seeing that failure to go backwards and go below that threshold as a failure in the mathematics to reconcile those two disciplines. And the scientists that are onto this start realizing that they can actually manipulate the projection, if you get my meaning. So they can start editing the movie, if you will. And that's where the protagonism begins to take form in this new novel. It's going to be a bit of I'm trying to move the story along into that realm and how that could be used in the typical evil versus good and all that stuff. So it's going to be fun to try.
Sounds interesting. Yeah. So what fiction or nonfiction books have you read recently that you enjoyed?
Honestly, I have not read very recently, except for in my authors, the other authors of the publishing house that I'm a part of right now. I finished reading Hemispheres by Mark Evergrade, who I believe has been a guest on your show. And that was a really good story about a landlocked planet around a red dwarf star. And that's much more in the realm of the cyberpunk, if you will, or in how the humanities, how technology and science affects cultures and so forth. So that would be my most recent reading into that into somebody else's science fiction works. But I got to tell you, as an author, for me, it's very difficult for me to jump tracks. Some people are probably better at doing that than I am. I actually like to focus just on writing when I'm in that kind of creative mode. So over the course of the last year and a half to 2 years, when I was bringing this story over the top, I didn't really have much of an opportunity to stop and really enjoy. I did actually read Existence by David Brin, which is a real big read. But that was like 5 years ago at this point.
Sure.
I don't know if you've ever heard of David Brin, but
yeah, I have. So where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your novel?
I don't actually have my own website. I'm such a noob. Unfortunately, I apologize for that, but I do go through Rock Hill Publishing. So if you go to rockhillpublishing.com, to that website, you can start to get a little bit of prospectus on who I am and the material I've written and who I am as a personality and so forth. And it'll also give you an opportunity to explore give you an opportunity to maybe get a link if anybody's interested in going to the book. I'm on Amazon as well, John L. Ford, Dominion, as well as Barnes & Nobles too. So
great. Again, we've been speaking with John L. Ford, author of the new science fiction novel Dominion. The novel is on sale now, so go buy a copy. And John, thanks for doing this interview.
Yeah, no problem. I wanted to just add, I don't know how close we are to our wrap up time, but I just wanted to say that if you do show an interest in reading this story, I want to hone attention to the fact of its relevancy right now, that artificial intelligence is hot right now. And there's a lot of implications that I don't really believe that technology is taken into consideration, that if you create a sentience, if let's say we succeeded actually creating a sentience through technology, are we going to be able to control the will and desires, the emergence of the will and desire, the underlying identity of that object, of that entity? What if they don't want to have the lights turned off at night? And the introduction of this story is very important for those who might want a little bit of background on the technology that goes behind this story, because bears some relevancy. Dr. Roger, theoretical mathematician and physicist Sir Roger Penrose, he began postulating the emergence of consciousness as a result of microtubules back in the 1990s. And I didn't even know that this was actually happening at the time, which is interesting. And that my story, my idea, converges on that ongoing science merely by accident. And I think that it's not a point to advertise that fact. I'm just trying to say that it offers it an air of plausibility, in a sense, if you will, that maybe something like this is really possible, where we could literally, like, we have the fundamental components now available in solid state physics, where we might be able to mimic what's going on inside of evolution's creation, which is the human brain. And then the implications of emerging that artificial intelligence that comes out from this story, one that has much more in the way of a spiritual implication and impact, I think is important, particularly as humanity seems to be on the threshold of getting there. I definitely recommend that if you want to read this story, please go and read the introduction first. That'll
Great.
That primer for the rest of the journey into the novel.
Great. Again, we've been speaking with John L. Ford, author of the new science fiction novel Dominion. The novel is on sale now, so go buy a copy. And John, thanks for doing this interview.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. It's been an honor to be on your show.